Шановні колеги, будемо.
Dear colleagues, we resume our work and the topic of current press conference is launch of Human Rights Watch World Report 2017, and we have Ms. Tanya, representative of Human Rights Watch in Ukraine, and Mr. Hugh Williamson, Europe and Central Asia Director, Human Rights Watch. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for coming to the press conference today. I am the Director for Europe and Central Asia at Human Rights Watch. I'm based in Berlin. In a moment, Tanya, my colleague, who is our Ukraine researcher and also the director of our new Kiev office, will give an introduction to our most recent research on Ukraine, which is published today as part of our 2017 World Report. Every year, Human Rights Watch publishes an annual or world report. It is being launched today in Washington, D.C. The launch in Washington, D.C. is linked to the inauguration next week of Donald Trump. We took the opportunity to focus on U.S. human rights issues and launch the report in Washington, D.C. But we also decided to launch the report in Kiev because the human rights issues here are important and because we have opened a new office and we would like to introduce our work on Ukraine and our work on other countries in the region to an audience here in Kiev and in Ukraine. After Tanya has spoken, I will talk a little bit about some other human rights issues in the United States, in Russia, in Europe, and in Turkey. The World Report covers 90 countries around the world, and in each country we have been measuring the country's adherence to human rights standards that they have voluntarily committed to international human rights norms. So every country is being assessed on that basis. After we've spoken, of course, we'll be happy to take questions, but I'll pass the word now to Tanya Cooper.
Спасибо большое, Хью. Дорогие журналисты, спасибо большое, что...
Thank you very much, Hugh. Thank you, dear journalists, for attendance of this press conference this late afternoon. As he already mentioned, almost at this very moment, there is a press conference big in the United States where we launch our global human rights watch. Now we are happy that we are opening this new office in Kiev, and we expect to have better results of our work in this country. This global review describing the situation in each country reflects major trends which raise our concerns in each particular country during the last year. When it comes to Ukraine, I would like to mention first some positive trends in the situation development. Thus, we found that some court proceedings in criminal cases were held, which were devoted to crimes committed by governmental forces in course of the Eastern conflict. For example, the Berkut regiment officers were subject to criminal persecution and court hearings for killing 4 people in course of the Maidan events. Also, I would like to add that those cases about Aidar soldiers, Tornado soldiers, should continue, and the investigation should continue. The second was the case of persecution of Ruslan Katsaba, famous journalist and blogger, who was accused of the state treason because he called for the sabotage of mobilization. We believe that the journalists should not be persecuted for their professional work and expression of opinion. The next positive trend is continuous protection or progress in protection of the LGBT community rights. And during 2014, we observed several positive moves in this direction in protection of the LGBT community rights. And now the government of Ukraine strengthens its work in this area. For example, I would like to mention the Pride Parade in Kiev last year. At the same time, we are concerned with the level of homophobia and transsexual phobia among bureaucrats in Ukraine remains rather high. So the work should continue in this area. Then, in our report, we wanted to point out major areas which should be of special focus for Ukrainian authorities, like documenting of tortures and cruel treatment towards the people done by Ukrainian authorities or by the authorities of so-called DPR or LPR. Last year, we carried out special survey and research with the Amnesty International and found out that both Ukrainian authorities and those so-called republics authorities tortured people and maltreated them. Some people were detained for very long, illegally detained for, and stayed in prison for very long period of time, up to 16 months. Those people were blamed for joining the opposite camp, so to say. They were deprived from the access to the legal advisors, to attorneys of law, and they were deprived from any information, and many of them became subject of maltreatment and tortures. Human Rights Watch, jointly with Amnesty International, carried out several surveys and also revealed that by the end of the last year, 18 prisoners were kept in the SBU prison. Some of them were held there for 16 months. 13 were released later, but 5 which were detained in Kharkiv in August were transported to another location in Kharkiv Oblast, where they stayed another 4 months, and only after this additional 4 months they were released. When we approached to the Security Service of Ukraine administration about these cases, they denied these facts. Also, the military prosecutor of Ukraine promised to carry out special investigation, but by now we do not see any results of it. As for the so-called DPR or LPR local their local authorities act actually without any respect to legal norms. People there are persecuted, and people are almost fully deprived from any access to human rights protection, and we try to document all such violations which become known to us. Another aspect which raises our concern is the limited freedom or restricted freedom of speech and pressure on journalists. Thus, during last year, some journalists which reported about the events in the East were blamed in separatism or state treason, etc. And Ukrainian authorities insufficiently proactively responded to such pressure. And for example, when personal details, names and contact details of some journalists were published, the response of power was absolutely insufficient. Then investigation of Pavlo Sheremet murder, who was killed last year, is not very effective, and the same is true for the cases of other journalists who were killed during last year. Also, we monitor the investigation and court proceedings as to Tornado and IDR soldiers, and we are very much concerned with the pressure made upon judges and other participants of those court hearings. I believe that in case the violence continues, the violence and pressure continues, it would be very difficult to expect just and fair court decision or sentences for the participants of those hearings. I would like to add a couple of words about situation in Crimea. Human Rights Watch has been dealing with the situation in Crimea from the very beginning, when Russia put the peninsula under its control, and our documented cases suggest that from that moment on, the situation had been worsening, and now worsened considerably. Last year, we observed the situation very closely and even traveled to Crimea, and we should say that persecution of Crimean Tatars for their peaceful oppression continues. They are persecuted, including criminal persecution, for their independent point of view. For example, they are blamed in violation of the territorial integrity of Russia. Recently, the Court of Russia remained in force previous court decision about extremist nature of Majlis, which put this organization beyond the legal field. Journalists are all in Crimea are also persecuted when they criticize any actions of the Russian authorities, or when they simply do their professional job. we understand clearly that Ukraine and Ukrainian government experienced great shocks during the last 2-3 years, and it experiences tragic events. But despite the external political situation and despite all the difficulties, Ukraine nevertheless should continue reforms and should more insistently follow the human rights implementation in the country, because this is the only way to remain a country with democratic principles in a region where authoritarian tendencies persist and even deepen and continue to spread. With this, I would like to give the floor to my colleague and allow him to describe our work in other countries.
Tanya, as we said, there will be time for questions after I have spoken a little bit about issues elsewhere in the world. The main theme of our World Report this year is that we are expressing very deep concern about the rise of populist leaders in the United States and in Europe, in government and outside government, as we fear they pose a threat to the protection of human rights issues in their countries and around the world. We are concerned about the human rights policies of the next president of the United States, Donald Trump, and I will talk about that, but also in Europe. And the theme of the report is to call on governments around the world to actively promote human rights policies and laws, but also to stand up for human rights values, which are under threat from authoritarian governments, from populist policies that use economic issues and cultural issues in order to provoke discrimination, intolerance against minorities in particular. We're also concerned about the use of propaganda and fake news by these governments and these bodies to undermine accurate reporting and to undermine protection of human rights around the world. I will just refer to some headline issues in various countries, and then please come back to me with questions if you have them for more information. Regarding the United States, in the report we are raising a signal, an alarm signal, that the Donald Trump administration could commit massive human rights violations unless the president gives up on proposals he's made in his election campaign. Since his inauguration, we've asked him to distance himself from sexist, xenophobic, discriminatory language and policies which have encouraged intolerance and abuse. Policies include his plan to deport 2 to 3 million so-called criminal immigrants out of the United States, which would lead to huge human rights violations, including against US citizens. He has called for the use of torture, which is both illegal and ineffective in tackling terrorism. His plan to end many parts of Obamacare and to limit access to maternity cover will have significant impacts on the poor in the United States and on women's rights. Those are some comments on the United States. I would like to talk a little bit about the situation in Russia. The situation in Russia is the most repressive we have seen in the post-Soviet period. So since the early 1990s. We have documented Russia. Human Rights Watch continues to have an office in Moscow. but we have seen a severe deterioration in human rights since the third term of President Putin started. For instance, in 2016, we documented a continuing and worsening situation with freedom of assembly. It's very difficult in Russia to organize a protest on the street or a rally on the street, particularly if you are a critical organization. We point in our report to the case of Ildar Dadin, a man who regularly organized single-person protests and is now in a penal colony in prison for 2.5 years because of his very simple, very straightforward protest action. We've documented the continuing use of the Foreign Agents Law against non-governmental groups that receive foreign funding, a very abusive law. Over 150 groups have been demonized, as we put it, since 2002, by the end of 2016, under this law, and 30 groups have closed down in order to avoid being registered as foreign agents. Freedom of expression is heavily restricted and was even more heavily restricted in 2016. A new law was introduced in July giving new surveillance powers to the security services, under which mobile phone companies and internet providers must store communications data for 6 months to give access to the security services to that data. This is a very repressive law that also impinges on privacy issues. We are also concerned about a new law in 2016 banning religious activities outside of recognized religious institutions in Russia. Outside Russia, via Russia's involvement in the war in Syria, we documented that Russia committed war crimes in Syria in its alliance with the Syrian government, particularly in September and October 2016, as part of its aerial bombing of the city of Aleppo. 440 civilians were killed, hospitals and schools were bombed indiscriminately. Russia has also been using internationally banned cluster munitions and incendiary weapons in Syria, which break international treaties. Russia has also blocked humanitarian aid through the United Nations, getting to the most vulnerable in Syria. Let me turn just briefly to the situation in Europe, where I'm based in Berlin. During 2016, the European Union failed to show leadership on the refugee crisis on the continent, which is the largest global displacement crisis since 1945. Of course, the numbers are big and the governments face many challenges, but the governments did too little to save the lives of 5,000 people who died or went missing in the Mediterranean during 2016 alone. That's the highest number on record, even though the numbers of people crossing the Mediterranean fell during 2016. The EU focused on closing its borders and pushing asylum seekers away from the continent, for instance, through the new agreement between European Union and Turkey, rather than on improving asylum conditions in Europe for asylum seekers. We also document the dangers of rising attacks on minorities and Muslims in European Union countries, and the growth of populist parties, as I said. The Brexit vote in the United Kingdom led to an upsurge in racist attacks against minority groups and Muslims. And we are watching key elections coming up in Europe over the next few months in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany. Many governments, including France, Belgium, adopted very tough counter-terrorism laws, which we are concerned about, as they expanded police powers and surveillance powers. Finally, I will just mention the situation in Turkey, because Turkey is very worrying for human rights organizations at the moment. There was a severe deterioration in human rights in Turkey after the failed coup in July 2016. 241 civilians and soldiers were killed in that attempted coup, and the government was right to resist the coup, and many people came out on the streets to defend the government, the legitimate government. However, since then, the government has instrumentalized the coup to crack down severely on human rights in the country. 100,000 civil servants, including teachers, judges, prosecutors, have been jailed or dismissed from their jobs in Turkey in the last 6 months. They have committed no crime. They have simply been labeled as oppositionalists by the Turkish authorities. And finally, the government imposed a state of emergency after the failed coup, and that has led to the use of torture and ill treatment in prisons and in police stations, as we documented in a report last month. Those are some of the main themes in certain countries in our report. I'd like to stop there and give an opportunity for questions from your journalists in the audience. Please feel free to ask questions in Russian or Ukrainian or in English. Thanks for your attention.
Дякую, колеги. Спасибо, коллеги. Есть ли вопросы к нашим спикерам?
Whether there are any questions to our speakers? I'm Lila, internet publication news from Donbass. What are the biggest difficulties which are experienced by prisoners in Donetsk Oblast, or by your teams when you try to discover the difficulties when you try to inspect these facilities? In general, we face difficulties in many countries, and of course our work in DPR and LPR is limited by those authorities, just similarly to the work of Ukrainian organizations, etc. Many international organizations were forced to leave these territories, and this concerns us very much, and especially in winter season when people need help so much, and unfortunately there are only few international organizations working there at the moment. We are very much concerned with this long time is isolation of those territories, and this draws attention of the human rights organizations and activists, journalists, mass media, etc. I believe that unfortunately these difficulties will continue and even grow. Whether you have a data about prisoners in the secret prisons of the security service of Ukraine. Those figures which I mentioned, these are the figures which are on our disposal. Hugh now demonstrates you the report which was produced by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, where we documented secret detentions and tortures of prisoners, both by Ukrainian authorities and authorities of so-called DPR and LPR. It was published in December 2016. Some weeks after publication of this review, 12 prisoners were released. By the way, attention to this problem. Attention of our organization and attention of our Ukrainian colleagues, which pointed out to this problem for a long period of time. It resulted in the release of those people, and I think this is very positive step forward in this issue. I can only hope that Ukrainian authorities take this issue seriously and have a wish to change this practice and won't detain civilians and won't torture them. Any further questions? Associated Press, Metrovlas.
Information in Russia for the past year. Is there any news on prisoners of the war you mentioned in Syria? So what is the situation with that, please?
I didn't quite catch the last part of the question, I'm sorry.
You mentioned about prisoners of the war in Syria provided by Russia. So can you give more information on that, please?
More information about the Russian involvement in the war in Syria? Yeah? Yeah. Human Rights Watch in 2016, along with other organizations working to monitor the situation in Syria, gathered very detailed information about the impact of bombing raids by Russian aircraft on towns in Syria. Both the Syrian government and the Russian military operation together have been targeting opposition forces to the Syrian government. And in doing so, they've failed to discriminate between opposition fighters and civilians. And that's why the civilian death toll has been so high in Syria. As I said, Russia has also, based on our documentation and other organizations' documentation, used illegal weapons in Syria, including cluster munitions, and which have killed many, many civilians. Separately, the Russian vetoes in the United Nations are also a scandal because they have prevented humanitarian organizations working properly to relieve humanitarian crisis in Syria, which is by the UN definition has been happening for several years now. So we have called repeatedly on Russia to at least support the creation of more humanitarian corridors in Syria. I hope that's helpful.
Спасибо. Есть ли еще вопросы, коллеги?
Any further questions? Tatiana Chiklova, maybe the last question. Whether you have any data about prisoners of war who are detained by Ukrainian party of the war, and whether Nadia Savchenko is doing right when she suggests to publish the list of those people. We try to monitor the situation in general. I mean, we try to monitor the situation about exchange of the prisoners of war, but I cannot say that in the last year we monitored this area in much detail. We monitor the violations of human rights which become known to us and which we can prove with some facts. And I think in the release or exchange with the prisoners of war, is the governmental affair, and it requires attention and compassion. As for the list of Nadia Savchenko, I think this is a reflection of her intention. It does not involve us. I don't think so. Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, Maria Yamets. Ukraine is now very much concerned with the future of its Ukrainian citizens and Crimean Tatars, which are now detained in Russian prisons. And they have charges for state treason, something like, or terrorism. How do you think what we can do and what can be done by international community to make pressure on Russia or to improve the conditions for those people, and how we can contribute to their future liberation? Of course, our big intention is to ensure that there is a fair attitude to them, that they are prevented from unjust charges, that they are treated properly, that they should not be forced to psychiatric expertise, and that they should be able to express their opinion by peaceful means. And of course, the goodwill of Russian authorities is only part of this problem. I think that all human rights activists, journalists, and other international actors should continue to raise the issues of these people, of these prisoners, and point out to the problem. Actually, I can add nothing new to this. We will continue our work in this area, of course. Any further questions? Well, it looks like there are no further questions.
Before we finish, I thought I would just outline one or two areas that Human Rights Watch will be researching in the coming year. In Ukraine, we will continue to monitor the situation in the whole country, particularly in the east. We are very concerned about human rights issues on the line of contact and the humanitarian situation there. As Tanya mentioned, many people wait for hours, if not days, on the line of contact and suffer human rights abuses in the process. We hope to have a research mission to Crimea in the first half of 2017. It's important that we do monitoring there and we observe the deteriorating human rights situation that Tanya mentioned and bring the abuses to the attention of the Russian authorities. We will also continue to focus on issues around children's rights in Ukraine. We published a report in early 2016 on the military use of schools in Ukraine and in the Russian-controlled areas, and we will continue to work on that to prevent schools being used as military targets. Those are a selection of the work we will be doing in coming months. Tanya will be leading from our office in Kiev. Any more questions or comments?
Вопросов больше нет. Спасибо, коллеги.
Since there are no further questions, we will finish.
About our World Report that was on the reception outside, please take copies. I also have copies of our recent reports on Ukraine here at the front. Please come and take a copy if you like.
Thank you, good luck and take care.
Thank you very much for coming.
Спасибо.